Marcus Williams, a successful black lawyer, smiled at his reflection in the mirror. Today was an important day, a day he had long awaited. He had come a long way, overcoming obstacles and fighting for every victory. His work, knowledge, and dedication had led him to success, and today he decided to celebrate his promotion at one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. This was a symbolic gesture for himself, a recognition of his worth and achievements. Marcus felt a slight nervousness mixed with pride. He knew he deserved this evening. The choice of the restaurant was deliberate, a place usually frequented by the wealthy and influential, a place associated with success and privilege. He wore his best suit, which fit him perfectly, highlighting his confidence and style. Marcus felt that tonight would be the perfect culmination of a long and difficult journey. However, as he approached the restaurant, he suddenly felt the stares that seemed to evaluate and judge, stares full of distrust and hidden hostility. These weren't just fleeting glances from passers-by, but something more. Marcus felt a mixture of irritation and anxiety boiling inside him. He was familiar with this feeling. It often arose in situations where he was judged not for his personal qualities or achievements, but for the color of his skin. When he entered the restaurant, this feeling intensified. A well-dressed couple sitting near the entrance looked at him closely, then exchanged glances. There was clear disapproval in their eyes. It was an instant but sharp realization. Despite his success and achievements, Marcus still faced invisible barriers. An inner voice whispered to him, "You are not one of them. You don't belong here." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to suppress the growing tension inside. He always knew that racism and bias were something he would have to overcome throughout his life. But now, in this elegant restaurant where he just wanted to celebrate his success, these barriers seemed especially cruel and unfair. He had to remind himself that he was there because he deserved to be there. He had earned the right to enjoy this evening just like everyone else. Sitting at his table, Marcus tried to distract himself from the unsettling feeling that had haunted him since he entered the restaurant. The waiter, a young man with a strained smile, took his order, but there was a certain coldness in his gaze. Every gesture, every word from this waiter reminded Marcus of his misfit in the surrounding environment. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself sinking deeper into his thoughts. He felt an invisible wall of prejudice surrounding him, making every glance and gesture seem suspicious and hostile. It was not just discomfort. It was an open challenge to his dignity and his right to be equal among equals. His attention was drawn back to the same couple he had noticed when he entered. They were sitting nearby, their conversation lively, but periodically their eyes would turn to him again. It soon became obvious that the topic of their conversation was about him being in this restaurant. This irritation grew inside him like a wave crashing against the shore. He wanted to turn around and tell them everything he thought, but instead he chose silence. Silence that weighed on his chest like a heavy burden. However, with each new contemptuous glance, with each whisper directed his way, Marcus felt anger rising within him. This anger was not just for himself, but for all those who faced similar attitudes. He realized that this place, this restaurant, symbolizing success, was steeped in racism and prejudice. When the evening was drawing to a close, and Marcus was about to ask for the check, that same couple, as if on purpose, decided to deliver the final blow. The man from the couple, tall and confident in his privilege, approached his table and stopped in front of him, arms crossed over his chest. His gaze was openly hostile. "Excuse me, but are you sure this place is right for you?" His voice sounded cold and challenging. Marcus slowly raised his head, looking into the eyes of his offender. At that moment he was boiling with anger and resentment inside, but outwardly he remained calm and collected. He knew that his response would not just be a reaction to the insult, but a public statement of his worth and dignity. "I'm sure of one thing," Marcus began, his voice steady, but with an underlying strength. "I'm sure I have every right to be here, just like you." The man froze, clearly not expecting such a confident and firm reaction. A silence fell over the room. All eyes were fixed on this scene. Marcus continued, "If this place symbolizes privilege for you, then for me it symbolizes hard work and achievement. And if anyone here doesn't meet the standards, it's those who think that a person's worth can be judged by the color of their skin." These words shocked those present. The couple, confronted with such a powerful rebuff, were at a loss. It was evident in their eyes that they hadn't expected such a reaction, especially from someone they considered unworthy. Marcus, despite the internal tremor, felt deep satisfaction that he had not given in to injustice and had not allowed himself to be humiliated. Shortly after the incident, Marcus left the restaurant. He felt the adrenaline still pulsing in his veins, but his soul was calm. He realized that this evening had been an important lesson for him. Despite success and status, the fight against racism and prejudice would never end. But most importantly, he had learned to stand up for himself and his truth, no matter the circumstances. Marcus Williams sat at his desk, staring out the window. The city that had always seemed alive and full of opportunities now appeared gray and lifeless. After the incident at the restaurant, which was supposed to be a simple celebration of his achievement, Marcus's life had changed dramatically. What should have been a pleasant memory turned into a nightmare that followed him everywhere. The phone on the desk gave a short beep, another new message. Marcus automatically reached for it, but hesitated as he remembered that every new message now caused him anxiety. Since the incident, he had started receiving hate mail and threats. At first, he tried to ignore them, thinking it was just a misunderstanding. But over time, the threatening messages became more frequent, each one fueling his fear and anxiety. His eyes landed on a letter lying on the edge of the desk. The envelope was already opened, and Marcus had read its contents, but that didn't diminish the letter's threatening power. Inside were insults and explicit threats to his life. It was a harsh reality he couldn't simply escape. Each letter, each message, carried a hatred that seemed intent on crushing his human dignity. "Why is this happening to me?" Marcus quietly asked himself, his voice weaker than he expected. He had always been a strong and confident person, used to fighting, but now that his success had become a target for hatred, he felt vulnerable. His career, which for many years had been his pride, now seemed at risk. He knew he was being watched every step of the way. He had to fight not only external threats, but also the internal fears that increasingly occupied his thoughts. Marcus understood that these threats were not just random attacks. This was systemic discrimination, which he now had to battle every day. Days passed, and the threats didn't stop. Every morning began with a new letter or message, and each time Marcus felt a mix of fear and anger. He knew that this hatred wasn't just directed at him personally, but at everything he represented. A successful black man who dared to claim a place in a society where many still considered him an outsider. One evening, while sitting in his apartment, Marcus pondered what he could do. He understood that he couldn't let fear paralyze him, but he also knew that this fear was real and justified. His thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. It was his friend and colleague, James. "Marcus, I've heard what's going on. How are you?" James's voice was full of concern. Marcus hesitated before answering. He wasn't used to showing weakness, even to close people, but at that moment, he needed to talk. "James, it's worse than I could have imagined," he finally admitted. I'm getting death threats every day. They want to scare me, to silence me, but I can't just give up." "I understand, brother," James replied. "But you're not alone. We all know you're right. These people want to destroy you because of what you stand for. But we're with you." These words were important to Marcus. He knew James was right, but it was still hard to fight the constant sense of threat. Every morning he woke up with anxiety, expecting new attacks. This was a battle not only for his career, but for his right to exist without fear, for his right to be respected and acknowledged. "I'm thinking of taking legal action," Marcus said after a pause. "They have no right to intimidate me. If this continues, I'll have to go to court." "That's a wise decision," James supported him. "You need to protect yourself and your life. But remember, we're always here. You're not alone in this fight." These words gave Marcus the support he needed. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but he also realized that fighting for justice was his duty, and he couldn't back down. A few days after the conversation with James, Marcus was walking home late at night. The streets were almost empty, and the city seemed strangely quiet. He was lost in thought when he suddenly felt a sharp blow to his back. He staggered, lost his balance, and fell to the ground. Several figures appeared before his eyes, followed by punches. The pain was sharp, but the most horrible part wasn't the physical suffering, but the realization that the attack had been premeditated, that it was the result of the hatred that had haunted him in recent weeks. "Do you think you're better than us?" one of the attackers snarled. "You'll never be like us." Marcus tried to defend himself, to raise his hands, but the blows kept coming. His vision blurred, and at some point, he felt darkness engulf him. But in that darkness, he suddenly felt a powerful wave of resolve. He couldn't let these people break him. He knew he had to endure, despite the pain and fear. When the attackers finally left him lying on the cold ground, Marcus gathered his strength and, despite the excruciating pain, slowly stood up. He knew that this attack was meant to intimidate him, to silence him, but they didn't know that it only strengthened his resolve to fight for justice. Later, when he was in the hospital, James visited him. "That was awful, Marcus," James said, his voice trembling with rage and worry. "But we can't let these people win." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice weak but firm. "They think they can silence me, but I won't let them. I'm going to court. I won't stop until I get justice." These words became his manifesto. Despite the pain and fear, he realized that his fight went beyond personal grievances. He was fighting not only for himself, but for everyone who faced similar injustice. And now, when he was on the brink, he felt he had found a new strength, a strength that allowed him to continue the fight despite all obstacles. Marcus Williams sat at his desk, trying to focus on the legal documents in front of him. However, his thoughts kept drifting to the past. He had just received a message from someone he hadn't expected to hear from, an old school friend named Eric. Eric, a white guy Marcus had once been friends with, had become a symbol of those times when racism wasn't just a problem, but a real part of his life. Recalling his school years, Marcus couldn't forget the day when Eric had bluntly told him, "Blacks will never be the same as whites." Those words, spoken in youth, left a deep scar on Marcus's soul, shattering their friendship and making him feel alone among his peers. It was a time when he first realized that the world wasn't as simple and fair as he had thought in childhood. Now, many years later, Eric had written to him, apologizing for his past behavior and asking to meet. Marcus was stunned. On the one hand, he felt a renewed anger due to the memories, and on the other, a vague desire to understand whether Eric had really changed and whether his apology was sincere. His internal conflict was becoming more evident. Forgiveness didn't come easily, especially when past hurts were deeply rooted in the heart. Marcus knew that this decision would require immense willpower and generosity of spirit. But could he forgive? Could he give Eric a chance, knowing how much pain he had caused? Marcus sighed heavily and put the papers aside. He understood that meeting with Eric was not just a way to close an old wound, but also an opportunity to deal with his own feelings and grievances. The question was whether he was ready to take this step. A few days later, Marcus stood in front of the cafe where he had agreed to meet with Eric. He felt a storm of emotions raging inside him. Annoyance, mixed with curiosity and fear, fought with the desire to figure out why Eric had decided to contact him after so many years of silence. Marcus entered the cafe and immediately spotted Eric sitting by the window. He looked tense, as if aware that the meeting would be difficult for both of them. As he approached the table, Marcus noticed Eric stand up, hesitantly extending his hand for a handshake. "Hi, Marcus," Eric said, his voice trembling. "I'm glad you agreed to meet." Marcus sat down silently, avoiding the handshake. He decided not to make things easy for Eric. "Why did you decide to write to me?" he asked directly, looking Eric straight in the eye. Eric sighed, as if summoning the courage to respond. "I've thought about it for a long time," he began. "The past has never let me go, Marcus. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. And I sincerely want to apologize for what I said back then. I was young and stupid, but that's no excuse." Marcus felt his heart clench. These words couldn't erase the past, but they carried an attempt at reconciliation that he hadn't expected. He took a deep breath, trying to contain the emotions rising inside him. "Eric, do you realize that your words changed me?" Marcus asked quietly, but firmly. "I lost a friend that day, and instead, I gained the painful realization that my skin could be a barrier for someone. Do you think an apology can make everything right?" Eric lowered his head, clearly feeling the weight of his past actions. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Marcus," he said. "I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that I've changed. I need this to move forward, to become a better person. But I understand if you can't do that." Marcus looked at Eric, feeling his anger gradually being replaced by a kind of sadness. This wasn't just a meeting of two old acquaintances. It was a confrontation between the past and the present, a clash that could either destroy all remaining ties or create something new. After a long pause, Marcus finally raised his head and met Eric's gaze. At that moment, he realized that their meeting was inevitable. It was an opportunity to close old wounds and, perhaps, give the past a place in his life without letting it control his future. "You know, Eric," Marcus began, his voice firm but calm, "forgiveness is more than just words. It's a process that takes time and effort. I don't know if I can forgive you completely, but I'm willing to try." Eric looked at Marcus with unexpected gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Marcus," he said quietly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll do everything I can to earn your trust." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight he had carried inside for all these years, slowly beginning to lift. Forgiveness wasn't immediate. It didn't erase the pain of the past, but it was the first step toward healing. He realized that forgiveness didn't make you weak. On the contrary, it made you stronger because it required more from you than just remembering the pain. This meeting became a catalyst for change for Marcus. He saw that sometimes people really can change, and that forgiveness is not a gift to another, but a release for oneself. Despite all the difficulties, he felt a peace inside that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was the first step on a long path to inner peace. Marcus Williams sat at his desk, absent-mindedly scrolling through documents on his computer screen. However, his thoughts were far from his current tasks. Recent events had left him in a state of constant tension. He noticed that lately, He had been receiving fewer assignments, and his involvement in important projects had suddenly diminished. This couldn't be just a coincidence. He had been excluded from a new major project he had dreamed of, a project where he could showcase his talents and reaffirm his high status within the company. Marcus tried to convince himself that this might be just a misunderstanding, a temporary situation. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about work. Too many coincidences had started to form a pattern, one Marcus had seen before in other situations. He knew this could be a manifestation of hidden discrimination, but he needed to be sure. He recalled a recent conversation with a colleague who had carelessly mentioned that management had decided to give the project to another lawyer. This colleague, apparently unaware of the impact these words could have on Marcus, had unintentionally confirmed his fears. In that moment, Marcus realized that his position in the company had begun to weaken, and this weakening was no accident. It was like an invisible wall growing between him and his career goals. His mind was filled with thoughts of how often black employees, even the most talented and successful, face similar barriers. It was like an invisible pressure that stifled and held back their potential. Marcus's anger simmered inside him, but he knew he needed to act cautiously. To uncover the truth and fight this injustice, he first had to find out what was behind his exclusion from the project. Over the next few days, Marcus dedicated himself to investigating the reasons for his exclusion from the project. He started with small conversations with colleagues, trying to gather as much information as possible. However, most either avoided the topic or spoke in vague terms, which only heightened his suspicions. "Listen, Marcus," one colleague began during a chance meeting in the hallway. "I'm sorry you're not on the project, but it seems management decided it wasn't your area of expertise." These words only reinforced Marcus's belief that it wasn't about his professional abilities, but something else. He knew his work had always been of high quality, and he could have made a significant contribution to the project. Soon, Marcus discovered that his suspicions were confirmed. During a conversation with the director's secretary, he learned that his name had originally been on the list of project participants, but was later replaced without explanation. This fact was the last straw. But why did they decide to remove me? Marcus kept asking himself as he dug deeper into the company's internal communications. He eventually stumbled upon a report from a management meeting. It mentioned the need to maintain the company's optimal image in front of clients, but without specific details. This led him to think that perhaps his exclusion was related to his race. Marcus decided not to let this slide. He knew he had to act decisively to stop this discrimination, but to do so, he needed more information, more evidence. He began collecting everything that could help him prove his case and expose those responsible for his exclusion. At the next company-wide meeting, Marcus gathered all his courage. He knew this might cost him his career, but he also understood that remaining silent would only strengthen the injustice. He was prepared for the shock his actions would cause among his colleagues and management, but he was ready to face all the consequences. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood up and looked directly at the faces in the room. He saw mixed emotions: surprise, concern, anticipation. This was the moment of truth, a moment that could change everything. "I want to talk about a problem that has long been present in our company, but is rarely discussed," he began, his voice firm, though it concealed a storm of emotions. "I was excluded from an important project without explanation, but I've found that this wasn't just a coincidence, but part of a systemic issue related to bias and discrimination." The room fell silent. Marcus's colleagues were shocked by his words, and the leaders clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. But Marcus didn't stop there. "I see invisible barriers being erected here for people like me," he continued. "We can be the best in our field, but when it comes to recognition and promotion, We're sidelined based on stereotypes and prejudices. Every word Marcus spoke was like a hammer blow to the invisible walls that had been built in the company. He saw the nervous glances exchanged among the leaders, and his colleagues, who had previously been able to ignore such things, were now forced to confront the truth. "I'm not asking for privileges," he concluded. "I'm demanding equality and justice. It's not just my right, but the duty of each of us to fight to make our company a place where everyone has equal opportunities." His words sparked a wave of discussion. Some colleagues supported him, while others were confused. But Marcus knew he had made the right move. He didn't allow fear and injustice to stop him. As a result of his speech, the company began to review its policies on promotion and project involvement. This step not only changed attitudes towards Marcus, but also gave hope to other employees who faced similar problems. Marcus realized that fighting for justice requires risk, but only through such actions can change be achieved. Marcus Williams was sitting in his office when the phone rang. He picked up the receiver, expecting another work-related call, but the voice on the other end made him uneasy. "Marcus Williams, this is the producer of the show Voice of the Nation. We'd like to invite you to our television program to share your story." Marcus froze. This was an unexpected offer. He knew that his name had started to gain attention in public circles after he openly exposed discriminatory practices at his workplace. But television? That was an entirely different level. It meant that his story would become public knowledge, potentially changing everything. Marcus couldn't help but think about the opportunities this would present. It was a chance to tell the truth to millions, to create a public outcry, and possibly influence changes not only in his company, but in society as a whole. But with that came growing concerns. What if his words sparked even more hatred? What if this made him a target for further attacks? He knew not everyone was ready to accept the truth, especially if it challenged their beliefs. "I'll think about it," he replied to the producer, feeling the onset of an internal conflict. He hung up the phone and pondered. Marcus realized that this wasn't just an invitation to a show. It was a challenge to his courage and determination. Fear and doubt battled with his desire to tell the truth. At that moment, he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had to make a decision that could change his life forever. In the days that followed, Marcus couldn't think of anything else. The thought of appearing on television became obsessive, not giving him any peace. He imagined countless times how he would speak, what words he would choose, how he would look into the camera, knowing that millions of eyes were on him. But along with this came doubts. Marcus knew that the truth had its price. He had already faced hatred and threats, and this appearance could intensify the pressure on him. He asked himself whether he was ready for this. Was he prepared to once again become a target for those who didn't want to hear the truth? One evening, while sitting at home, he was visited by his friend James. "I heard you were offered a spot on television," James said, sitting down across from Marcus. "Yes, that's right," Marcus replied with a sigh. "But I'm not sure if it's the right decision." "Marcus, you've already done so much to make people hear you. This is a chance to tell your story to even more people. I know it's scary, but if not you, then who?" James spoke confidently, his words full of support. Marcus nodded, sensing that his friend was trying to give him strength. But the fear remained. He knew this wasn't just a performance, but a battle for the truth. And this battle could be dangerous. "I understand what you're saying, James," Marcus said quietly. "But every time I think about stepping on that stage and telling my story, I remember all the threats I've received. I'm not afraid for myself, I'm afraid for my family, that this might affect them." James looked at him with understanding and replied, "Marcus, the truth always scares those who fear change. But if you don't tell your story, someone else will, and maybe it will be distorted. You need to be the voice for those who can't speak." These words deeply resonated with Marcus. He realized that his fears shouldn't dictate his decision. He was ready to fight for the truth, even if it meant facing new challenges and risks. The day of the appearance arrived. Marcus stood backstage, listening to the muffled voices of the audience and feeling the pounding rhythm of his heart. He knew that in a few minutes he would have to step onto the stage and share his story. A story of discrimination, injustice, and his fight for equality. When the producer gave the signal, Marcus took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The spotlight was blinding, but he didn't look away, directing his gaze straight at the show's host, who greeted him with a slight smile. "Marcus Williams, thank you for joining us today," the host began. "Your story has attracted a lot of attention. Tell us, how did it all begin?" Marcus paused for a moment. This was the moment he had both feared and anticipated. He knew that every word would matter, that it would be judged, criticized, praised, or condemned, but he was ready. "It all started when I encountered invisible barriers that often stand in the way of people like me," he began, his voice steady, but with an underlying power. "These barriers aren't visible at first glance, but they exist and oppress us, make us feel unworthy, even when we deserve more." He spoke about the discrimination at work, about how he was excluded from a project, how he realized that his success couldn't protect him from racism. With every word, he felt the tension in the room growing. Marcus knew that his words were resonating. He saw how the audience sat, holding their breath, immersed in his story. "I understand that the truth can be uncomfortable," he continued, "but we must talk about it, because only through openness and honesty can we change our society. I'm not afraid to speak the truth because I know it's the only way to achieve justice." When he finished, the room fell silent. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had told his story, despite the fears and doubts. After the broadcast, his phone didn't stop ringing. He received messages from people who supported him, thanked him for his courage. But there were also those who hated him for daring to shed light on a problem that many preferred to ignore. Marcus understood that his appearance wouldn't go unnoticed. He knew it would lead to new challenges, but he also felt that he had taken the right step. He realized that the truth always has a price, but it's a price he was willing to pay for the sake of change. Marcus Williams sat in his office, staring at the fresh certificate lying on the desk before him. It was official recognition of his success, another promotion, another step up the career ladder. He had achieved what he had long strived for, despite all the obstacles that had stood in his way. However, instead of the expected joy, he felt a strange sense of emptiness. Marcus's life had always been a struggle. He was used to every success being hard-earned, knowing that every step forward concealed a new hurdle. But now, when he had reached another peak, he felt no joy or pride, only a cold emptiness that filled his thoughts more and more. He recalled how, a few years ago, he had dreamed of such an opportunity, being recognized in his company, achieving a high position, becoming someone to be proud of. But now that it had become a reality, Marcus began to doubt the true value of his success. Had he merely been a convenient figure for the company? Were his achievements being used as a way to demonstrate false inclusivity? These thoughts tormented him, eroding his belief in his own accomplishments. An inner voice whispered that it was all just an illusion, that his success was not his own merit, but a tool in the hands of those who wanted to create the appearance of equality, masking their true intentions. Marcus tried to dismiss these thoughts, but they kept returning, forcing him to question what lay behind his career achievements. Inside him, a conflict had begun, demanding resolution. A few days later, Marcus was invited to a corporate party celebrating the company's successes and employee awards. Normally, such events didn't excite him, but today he decided to go, hoping to dispel his doubts and find answers to the questions that plagued him. When he entered the hall, filled with light and music, he was greeted with smiles and congratulations. However, behind those smiles, Marcus sensed something different: insincerity and hidden resentment. Colleagues congratulated him, but their eyes didn't reflect true joy for him. "Great job, Marcus," one of the executives said, shaking his hand. "You deserved this promotion." Marcus nodded in response, but couldn't shake the feeling that his success was perceived not as a victory, but as yet another concession made for the sake of political correctness. He noticed how some colleagues exchanged glances, whispering quietly among themselves. The looks he caught were full of hidden judgment, as if they doubted his merits and considered his promotion the result of external pressure, not his professional qualities. During the event, he tried several times to engage in conversations with colleagues about current projects, but the discussions quickly died out. He felt that people were avoiding him, as if his presence had become a reminder of an uncomfortable truth everyone preferred to ignore. Marcus realized that his achievements weren't being accepted as they should be, and this realization deepened his internal conflict. He began to wonder what truly lay behind his successes, and whether he was just a convenient tool for demonstrating the company's inclusivity. The evening reached its climax when one of his colleagues, clearly having had too much to drink, approached him with a glass in hand. Marcus was standing by the bar, trying to distance himself from the general atmosphere of the party. "Marcus, you do realize this is all just one big game, right?" the colleague said with a smirk, leaning in too close to Marcus. "All these promotions, awards, it's all to make the company look good. You're just part of the show." These words felt like a slap in the face. Marcus felt anger mixed with pain boiling inside him. He knew that this man was expressing thoughts shared by many in the company, but no one dared to say them aloud. Now, however, this truth had struck him like a knife to the heart. "You can't be serious," Marcus replied, trying to keep his composure. "My success is the result of my hard work, not some game." Sure, the colleague smirked again, taking another sip. "But let's be honest. We all know it's part of the policy. Don't take it personally. It's just business." These words shattered Marcus's illusions completely. All his achievements, everything he had fought for, suddenly seemed meaningless. He realized that his success was nothing more than a facade behind which the company's true intentions were hidden. They were using him as a front to show their progressiveness, but they didn't truly value him as a professional. Marcus left the party, feeling his faith in justice and equality crumbling inside him, but at the same time, he realized that his fight was far from over. On the contrary, it was just beginning. Now he understood that his goal was not just to achieve success, but to change the system that used people as tools to achieve its own ends. Marcus Williams sat at his desk, thoughtfully staring at the computer screen where the details of another case demanded his attention. But his mind was far from legal matters. He had just received a message from an old friend, an activist, inviting him to participate in a protest against police brutality that was scheduled for the upcoming weekend. This protest had been triggered by recent events where yet another case of police misconduct resulted in the death of a young black man. The public was outraged, and the protest promised to be massive. Marcus knew that his participation could be a powerful symbol. As a successful lawyer and someone who had already faced racism, his presence could draw attention to the issue and support those fighting for justice. However, with this invitation came many doubts. Marcus knew that participating in the protest could impact his career. In the company where he worked, active political stances, especially on such controversial topics, were not encouraged. It could lead to a break with his employer or provoke discontent among his colleagues. The conflict between his moral duty and professional obligations became a source of great internal turmoil. Marcus felt his heart oscillating between these two poles, unsure which choice would be the right one. He knew that his participation could benefit society, but he also realized it might jeopardize everything he had achieved professionally. "What should I do?" he quietly asked himself, unable to find an answer. But one thing was certain: this issue was too important to ignore. In the end, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. His moral duty outweighed his fear of potential consequences, and he decided to participate in the protest. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also understood that his voice could serve as support for those suffering from injustice. On the day of the protest, Marcus stood among a crowd of people gathered in the city's central square. People carried signs, chanted slogans against police brutality, and called for reforms and justice. The atmosphere was tense, yet inspiring. Marcus felt he was part of something bigger than just a protest. It was a movement for rights and freedoms, for the ability to live without fear of those who were supposed to protect, not oppress. Among the protesters, Marcus recognized familiar faces: activists, lawyers, human rights defenders. He felt he had made the right choice, which gave him confidence, but at the same time, he couldn't help but notice the presence of the police. Officers lined the streets, watching the proceedings with stern expressions. Marcus knew that the situation could escalate at any moment. "Marcus, glad to see you here," a voice called out from behind. He turned to see James, one of the protest organizers. "I couldn't stay away, James," Marcus replied, shaking his friend's hand. "This is more than just a protest. It's our fight for justice." "You're right," James nodded. "But be careful. The police are on edge, and they might react aggressively. We need to stay calm, but firm." Marcus understood this. He knew that any wrong move could trigger harsh actions from the police. But he also realized that his presence here wasn't by chance. He had come to support those who couldn't speak for themselves, who had become victims of a system that was supposed to protect them. The protest continued for several hours until the situation began to spiral out of control. Tensions rose as a group of protesters tried to approach the police, demanding a dialogue. The police responded harshly, and soon clashes broke out. Marcus found himself in the thick of it as officers began dispersing the crowd with force. Suddenly, he felt a strong blow to his shoulder. One of the police officers had struck him with a baton, trying to push him away from the line. Marcus lost his balance and fell to the ground. He felt adrenaline surge through him, a mixture of fear and anger. But he knew he couldn't give in to panic. He got back on his feet, trying to remain calm despite the chaos around him. "Stop!" Marcus shouted, addressing the officer. "We're not here to fight. We're demanding justice." His words were drowned out by the noise, but he saw other protesters starting to repeat his call. They tried to maintain peace despite the aggression from the police. Marcus felt that his voice had been heard, but he also knew the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. Soon, panic set in, and Marcus found himself cut off from the rest of the group. He saw police arresting people, using force to disperse the crowd. It was a terrifying sight that underscored the brutality of the system. But despite his fear for his safety, Marcus stood his ground, knowing that his presence here was significant. When he finally found safety, having slipped into an alley, he realized that his life had changed. This protest was not just an action against police brutality, but a personal trial. He understood that his duty now extended beyond defending people in court. He also had to fight for their rights on the streets. Marcus realized that his path was now inextricably linked with the fight for justice. and he was ready to go all the way, despite all the dangers and challenges that might arise along the way. Marcus Williams stood in his office, staring at his phone. He had just received news that made him inwardly recoil. One of his close friends, Jared, a man with whom they had gone through many trials, had accepted an offer from a company known for its discriminatory practices. This news hit Marcus like a punch in the gut. He had always considered Jared his ally, someone who shared his values and beliefs. How could he do this? These thoughts filled Marcus's mind, mixing anger and disappointment with a sense of betrayal. He remembered their countless conversations about the need to fight injustice and racism, about their common goal of making the world a better place for everyone, regardless of skin color. But now it seemed all those conversations had been empty words. Marcus couldn't believe that Jared could justify such actions. He tried to find an explanation. Perhaps his friend had been forced to accept the offer under pressure, but the more he thought about it, the stronger his disappointment grew. Marcus felt that Jared's decision was not just a mistake, but a conscious choice that went against their shared convictions. This situation made Marcus reflect on how far he was willing to go for his principles. He knew that the world was not always black and white, that sometimes compromises were necessary, but was he willing to sacrifice his principles for the sake of gain? The thought was unbearable. A few days later, Marcus finally gathered the courage to talk to Jared. They met in a small cafe where they usually discussed work and plans for the future. But today, the atmosphere between them was tense and anxious. "I heard about your decision, Jared," Marcus began, looking his friend straight in the eye. "Did you really decide to work with that company?" Jared didn't answer right away. He knew this conversation was inevitable, but he hadn't expected it to be so difficult to find the right words. "Yes, I accepted their offer," he finally said, lowering his gaze. "But Marcus, it's not as simple as it seems. I know that company isn't perfect, but I had my reasons." "And what reasons are those?" Marcus asked sharply, barely holding back his growing anger. "We've talked so many times about not supporting those who oppress others. How could you justify this to yourself?" Jared sighed, realizing that his justifications sounded weak even to himself. "I was thinking about my family, Marcus," he began, "about my career. I'm tired of fighting against a system that always wins. This contract is an opportunity for me and my family to secure a stable future. I can't afford the luxury of turning down such an opportunity." These words hit Marcus deeply. He understood that Jared was in a difficult situation, but he also realized that this choice was a betrayal not only of their shared principles, but of the entire struggle they had fought together. "Do you really think betraying your beliefs is worth the money?" Marcus asked, his voice cold and firm. "I can't support your decision, Jared. I can't accept that you're willing to work with those who discriminate and oppress for the sake of profit." A tense silence hung between them. Marcus felt their friendship crumbling before his eyes. He understood that sometimes compromises were necessary, but Jared's choice seemed unacceptable to him. After the meeting with Jared, Marcus couldn't find peace for a long time. He understood that their friendship had probably come to an end, but he also realized that he couldn't compromise his principles, even for the sake of the closest people. It was painful, but necessary. A few days after their conversation, Jared called Marcus. His voice was subdued, as if he understood that this would be one of their last conversations. "Marcus, I understand how you feel," Jared began, "and I'm sorry things turned out this way, but I hope you can understand me, even if you don't agree with my decision." Marcus sighed, feeling a bitter taste in his mouth. He knew he couldn't just forget what had happened, but he also realized that holding on to resentment was pointless. "Jared, I understand that you did it for your family," Marcus replied, "but I can't accept your decision. We've always fought for justice, and for me, that means more than any profit. I can't stand by those who are willing to betray our principles." The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. Marcus knew that their paths were diverging, but he also understood that this choice was inevitable. "I respect your decision, Marcus," Jared finally said, "but please don't judge me too harshly. Each of us has our own battle." Marcus nodded, even though Jared couldn't see it. "I won't judge you," he replied, "but I can't change how I feel about what you did." After that conversation, Marcus felt a heavy weight on his heart. He understood that sometimes you have to lose close people to maintain honor and dignity. He realized that his principles were more important than any relationship, even if it meant standing alone in his fight. This situation made him realize even more deeply that the fight for justice requires sacrifices, and those sacrifices are not always measured in money or career. Sometimes they are relationships that turn out to be weaker than the principles worth fighting for. Marcus Williams stood in front of the mirror in his office, preparing for a speech he was about to deliver to law students. This was supposed to be an important event, a chance to share his experiences of fighting racism and discrimination, to inspire the younger generation to take action. But inside, he was plagued with doubts. He knew that his words would have a significant impact on those who were listening, but he also understood that this speech could provoke a mixed reaction. He had already encountered people who thought his views were too radical, who saw his words as a threat to the established order. Marcus often wondered how far he could go in speaking the truth and how it might affect his life and career. "I must be honest," he quietly told himself, trying to calm down. "I must say what I believe is right, even if it doesn't please everyone." These thoughts filled his mind as he made his way to the university. Marcus knew that his words would be scrutinized. He felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but he also knew that he couldn't let down those who looked up to him as a symbol of courage and resilience. When Marcus stepped onto the stage in front of a full auditorium of students, he felt his doubts fade into the background. He began his speech by sharing his journey, the challenges he had faced, and the decisions he had to make. His words were filled with sincerity and truth. The students listened intently, holding their breath. Marcus could see how some of them were genuinely inspired by his courage, their eyes lighting up with enthusiasm and a desire to change the world. But at the same time, he noticed others who looked at him with suspicion and distrust. These students seemed to think that his words were too harsh and could lead to unnecessary tension. "We must fight racism not only with words, but with actions," Marcus continued, his voice confident. "We must demand equality and justice, and we must not be afraid to speak the truth, even if it makes others uncomfortable." Suddenly, one of the students sitting in the back row stood up abruptly and interrupted him. "You're inciting hatred, Williams," the student shouted, his voice trembling with anger. "You're trying to divide society even more. We can't live in constant conflict." Marcus froze. This moment took him by surprise and stirred an inner conflict. He knew that his words could be perceived differently, but he didn't expect such open hostility. "I'm not inciting hatred," Marcus replied calmly, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I'm calling for justice. Ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away. We need to talk about racism and discrimination to find ways to overcome them." But the student wasn't willing to listen to his explanation. "You're fanning the flames where there shouldn't be any," the student continued, refusing to back down. "Your words could lead to violence." Marcus felt anger starting to boil within him. He knew that his words might be uncomfortable, but he also understood that he had to stand his ground. Tension in the auditorium began to build. Marcus realized that the situation could get out of hand, but he also knew that he couldn't retreat. His words needed to be heard, even if they provoked such a reaction. "I understand your concerns," he addressed the student who had challenged him. "But the truth is that ignoring problems has never solved them. Yes, my words may seem harsh, but they reflect the reality we live in, a reality we must fight if we want change." The student seemed ready to respond, but suddenly fell silent, perhaps struck by Marcus's words. The room was filled with silence. Marcus sensed that this pause was charged with tension and anticipation. He knew that this was a moment of truth when everyone would have to decide where they stood. Unexpectedly, another student, sitting closer to the stage, raised his hand and began to speak. "I think Marcus is right," the student said, his voice steady. "We can't continue to ignore racism and injustice. We must talk about it, even if it's uncomfortable. I support you, Marcus." These words triggered a chain reaction. Other students started voicing their opinions, some supporting Marcus, others expressing their doubts. The auditorium turned into a lively debate, but Marcus felt that he had achieved his goal. He had made people think, ignited a desire to take action. However, along with this, he realized that his words carried enormous power. He understood that every word he spoke could cause a storm of emotions, and that he was responsible for the consequences of those words. He could no longer speak just for the sake of speaking. He now knew that every speech had to be carefully considered, not to cause division, but to become a source of inspiration and strength. When the event ended, Marcus felt exhausted, but also satisfied. He realized that his mission was not only to fight for justice, but also to bear responsibility for those who listened to him and were ready to follow his lead. Marcus Williams sat in his office, looking at the wall where his diplomas and awards were displayed. These symbols of success, which he had once been so proud of, now seemed empty and meaningless. He had achieved much in the corporate world, reached a position that brought him respect and a comfortable life. But behind all this success lay a sense of internal discord. After all the trials he had gone through, Marcus began to question whether continuing his career was worth it. On the surface, it seemed he had reached everything he could dream of, but an inner voice wouldn't leave him in peace. This voice reminded him of how he truly felt in this world, a world that didn't fully accept him, despite all his achievements. Marcus felt that his values, his pursuit of justice, were increasingly at odds with the corporate culture in which he found himself. Every time he encountered another instance of racism or discrimination, he felt something inside him break. These situations forced him to make a choice, either to accept it for the sake of his career or to fight for what he believed in. These thoughts consumed him more and more, making him ponder the future. He felt he needed to do something more meaningful, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to give up what he had worked for so many years to build. A conflict raged within him, growing more unbearable by the day. Marcus delved deep into thoughts about what truly mattered to him. His career, success, and recognition had been achieved at the cost of a constant struggle with a system that seemed never to fully accept him. But was that struggle worth it? He felt that the corporate world was increasingly consuming him, pulling him away from the ideals he had always held dear. One day, Marcus met with James, his old friend and mentor, in a small cafe. They discussed recent events and the thoughts that had been troubling Marcus. "James, I'm no longer sure I want to continue my career in this company," Marcus confessed, taking a sip of coffee. "Every day, I feel like I'm losing myself, my principles, my ideals. It feels like my work has become more about surviving than doing something important." James listened carefully, looking at his friend with understanding. "I understand what you're saying, Marcus," he said with a sigh. "I've seen how you've changed over the years. You've always been a fighter, but it seems like this fight has started to break you down. Maybe it's time to think about what's really important to you." These words struck a chord with Marcus. He knew that James was right, but making a decision wasn't easy. He felt obligated to continue his career, believing it was his duty to himself and his family. But he also understood that his true calling might lie outside the corporate world. "I've been thinking about leaving," Marcus finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "To devote myself to human rights work, to do something that really matters. But I'm afraid of losing everything I've worked for." "And then what?" James smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his friend's shoulder. "You won't lose anything, Marcus. You'll find yourself, and that's far more important than all the money and recognition in the world." These words became a turning point for Marcus. He realized that he had to make a decision that would change his life, but this decision had to be based on who he truly wanted to be. The resolution came to Marcus a few days later. He felt something within him crystallize, forming a clear understanding of what he needed to do. He realized that his true calling wasn't just about work, but about fighting for justice, for the rights of those who couldn't defend themselves. On the day he made his final decision, Marcus went to work with a sense of ease he hadn't felt in a long time. He gathered his colleagues for a small meeting to announce his decision. "Friends, I have something important to tell you," he began, feeling his confidence grow within him. "I've decided to leave the company. I've thought long and hard about this, and realized that I can no longer continue working here without betraying my principles and values." His colleagues were shocked by his words. Some couldn't believe that Marcus, a successful and respected lawyer, was willing to give up his career for something so uncertain. A silence fell over the room, and Marcus could feel the impact his decision had on those present. "I want to dedicate myself to human rights work," he continued. "I feel that my work here has become more about money and status than about doing something important. I want to change that and do something that will make a real difference." After his speech, some colleagues approached him to express their surprise, while others offered their support. But Marcus knew he had made the right choice. He understood that his true calling was not a career in the corporate world, but a fight for justice, for the ideals that had always been important to him. As Marcus left the office for the last time, he felt his soul fill with new meaning. He was no longer bound by obligations to a system that had oppressed him and others. Now he was free to follow his true calling, to defend those who needed his help, and to fight for a world where everyone would be equal. Marcus Williams stood at the entrance of the small human rights organization where he had recently started working. The atmosphere around him was lively, employees discussing current cases, activists preparing for meetings, and volunteers distributing tasks. Marcus felt a slight nervousness. After leaving the corporate world, which once seemed like the pinnacle of his career, he was now on the brink of a new life, full of uncertainty. As he walked inside, he was greeted by the organization's coordinator, Anne, whom Marcus had met during one of the protests. She was an experienced human rights advocate, a person with a steely will and a clear understanding of what was needed to fight injustice. "Welcome to the team, Marcus," Anne said, extending her hand to him. "We're thrilled that you decided to join us. We need your experience and your passion." Marcus nodded as he shook Anne's hand. He felt he was making the right move, but he was also aware that this path would be filled with challenges and trials. He was about to face new obstacles, ones for which he wasn't entirely prepared, but he knew that his inner resolve and desire to make a difference would guide him. The transition from the corporate world to human rights work was not easy. The resources available at the organization were limited, and the cases they handled were often complex and emotionally taxing. Marcus quickly realized that his legal skills, honed in the corporate arena, would need to be adapted to the realities of this new environment. One of his first assignments was to help a group of tenants in a low-income neighborhood who were being illegally evicted by a landlord, trying to redevelop the area for luxury housing. The situation was dire. Families who had lived in their homes for decades were suddenly facing homelessness. The landlord had used every trick in the book, exploiting legal loopholes and using intimidation tactics to force the tenants out. Marcus felt a deep sense of responsibility as he began working on the case. He knew that these people had no one else to turn to, and their hopes rested on his ability to navigate the legal system in their favor. This was not just a legal battle, it was a fight for their dignity and their right to a safe and stable home. As Marcus delved deeper into the case, he encountered numerous challenges. The landlord's legal team was formidable, well-funded, and unrelenting. They threw up roadblocks at every turn, using delay tactics and legal technicalities to wear down the tenant's resolve. But Marcus, drawing on his years of experience, countered each move with precision and determination. Despite the obstacles, Marcus found a renewed sense of purpose in this work. Unlike in the corporate world, where victories often felt hollow, here every small win had a profound impact on people's lives. He was no longer working for a paycheck or a promotion. He was fighting for justice, for the people who had been systematically overlooked and oppressed. Weeks turned into months, and the case slowly progressed. Marcus spent countless hours preparing documents, meeting with tenants, and strategizing with his colleagues. The pressure was immense, but it was balanced by the sense of solidarity he felt with the people he was helping and the team he was now a part of. One day, after a particularly grueling court session, Marcus returned to the office to find a group of tenants waiting for him. They had gathered to thank him for his efforts, bringing homemade food and small gifts as tokens of their appreciation. Marcus was deeply moved by this gesture. It was a stark contrast to the sterile acknowledgments of his previous corporate achievements. This gratitude was genuine and heartfelt. "Thank you, Marcus," said one of the tenants, an elderly woman whose family had lived in the building for over 40 years. "You've given us hope when we thought we had none left." These words resonated deeply with Marcus. They reminded him of why he had made the difficult decision to leave behind a lucrative career and step into this uncertain but meaningful work. He realized that the rewards of this path were not measured in money or titles, but in the impact he could have on real people's lives. As the case neared its conclusion, Marcus prepared for the final court hearing. The stakes were high, but he felt a calm determination. He knew that whatever the outcome, he had done everything in his power to stand up for what was right. The day of the hearing arrived, and Marcus stood before the judge, presenting the tenant's case with clarity and conviction. The landlord's legal team attempted their usual tactics, but this time they were met with strong resistance. Marcus had anticipated their moves and was ready with counter-arguments that left little room for doubt. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, it was in favor of the tenants. The eviction was ruled illegal, and the tenants were allowed to remain in their homes. The courtroom erupted in quiet cheers, and Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of relief and fulfillment. He had won a significant victory, not just in the legal sense, but in a battle for justice and humanity. As he left the courthouse, surrounded by the grateful tenants and his colleagues, Marcus knew that he had found his true calling. The journey had been difficult, and there were many more challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace with the path he had chosen. This new chapter in Marcus's life was just beginning, but he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he was exactly where he needed to be, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, making a real difference in the world. Marcus Williams walked down the bustling street, the cool evening air brushing against his face. The city was alive with energy, people hurrying home, couples strolling hand in hand, and street vendors calling out to passers-by. But Marcus's thoughts were elsewhere. The recent victory in court had brought him a profound sense of fulfillment, but it also left him pondering the next steps in his journey. As he passed by a small park, Marcus noticed a group of young people gathered around a speaker, listening intently. Curious, he slowed his pace and moved closer. The speaker, a young woman with a powerful voice and a commanding presence, was talking about the importance of community activism and the need to address systemic inequalities. "Change doesn't happen in courtrooms alone," she said, her voice resonating with passion. "It happens in the streets, in our communities, in our homes. We need to be the change we want to see." Marcus was struck by her words. He realized that while his legal work was crucial, there was another aspect to the fight for justice that he hadn't fully explored: grassroots activism. The power of community, of people coming together to demand change, was something he deeply admired, but had yet to fully engage with. After the woman finished her speech, Marcus approached her, feeling an urge to connect. "You were incredible up there," he said, extending his hand. "My name is Marcus Williams." "Thanks," she replied, shaking his hand with a warm smile. "I'm Layla. I've seen you around at a few events. You're the lawyer who's been helping those tenants, right?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, that's me. But listening to you tonight made me realize there's more I can do. I've been focused on the legal side of things, but what you're doing, mobilizing people, raising awareness, it's just as important." Layla's eyes lit up. "We're all in this together, Marcus. The legal battles are important, but so is building a movement that empowers people to stand up for themselves. There's a power in community that can't be replicated in a courtroom." Her words resonated with Marcus. He had always believed in the power of the law to bring about change, but he now understood that the law was just one tool in a much larger toolbox. He needed to broaden his approach, to connect with people on the ground and help them harness their collective strength. "Is there any way I can get involved with what you're doing?" Marcus asked, eager to learn more. Layla smiled again. "Absolutely. We could use someone with your skills and experience. We're organizing a series of workshops to educate people about their rights and how to advocate for themselves. It's all about empowering the community. Would you be interested?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Count me in." Over the next few weeks, Marcus became more deeply involved in Layla's work. He helped organize and lead workshops, using his legal expertise to teach people about their rights and how to navigate the system. He found that working directly with the community, helping individuals understand their power, was incredibly rewarding. The workshops were held in various locations: community centers, churches, even people's homes. Each session was packed with people eager to learn, to equip themselves with the knowledge they needed to protect their families and their neighborhoods. Marcus saw firsthand the impact this work was having. People who had once felt powerless began to speak up, to organize, and to challenge the injustices they faced. One evening, after a particularly successful workshop, Marcus and Layla sat down to reflect on their progress. The small cafe where they met was quiet, a perfect place to unwind and share thoughts. "I've learned so much from you," Marcus admitted, sipping his coffee. "This work, it's opened my eyes to a whole new way of making a difference. I used to think that winning cases in court was the best way to fight for justice. But now, I see that real change happens when people come together, when they find their own voice." Layla nodded, her expression thoughtful. "The law is important, Marcus, and what you're doing in the courtroom is vital. But you're right. Change is about more than just winning battles in court. It's about shifting power, about helping people realize that they have the right to demand more from the world around them. Marcus felt a deep sense of connection with Layla and the work they were doing. For the first time in a long while, he felt that he was on the right path, that he was contributing to something larger than himself. It was a feeling of fulfillment that went beyond any courtroom victory. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus found himself increasingly embedded in the community. He became a familiar face at protests, neighborhood meetings, and advocacy events. He used his legal knowledge to support the movement, but he also learned to listen, to understand the needs and struggles of those he was helping. This was not just about providing legal solutions. It was about being part of a movement that was striving to build a better world from the ground up. The more Marcus became involved, the more he realized that this work was where he truly belonged. He had found a new purpose, one that combined his passion for justice with a deep commitment to the people he was now working alongside. It wasn't always easy. There were setbacks, frustrations, and moments of doubt. But Marcus knew he was exactly where he needed to be. One day, after a particularly successful community event, Layla approached Marcus with a proposal. "Marcus, we've been talking, and we think it's time to take this to the next level," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "We want to start a new organization, one that combines legal advocacy with grassroots activism. We need someone with your skills and experience to help lead it. What do you think?" Marcus was taken aback by the offer. It was a bold idea, one that would require a lot of work and commitment. But he also felt a surge of excitement at the thought of building something new, something that could make an even bigger impact. "I'm in," he replied without hesitation. "Let's do it." And so, a new chapter began for Marcus. Together with Layla and a dedicated team of activists and advocates, they founded an organization that aimed to bring together the best of both worlds, legal expertise and grassroots power. It was a daunting task, but Marcus knew that they had the potential to create real, lasting change. As the organization grew, so did its influence. They took on cases that others wouldn't touch, defended the rights of the most vulnerable, and empowered communities to stand up for themselves. Marcus found himself busier than ever, but he didn't mind. He was doing the work he had always dreamed of, surrounded by people who shared his passion and commitment. Through it all, Marcus remained grounded in the principles that had guided him from the start: justice, equality, and the belief that every person had the right to live with dignity. He had found his true calling, and he knew that this was just the beginning.